Chapter 5, The Toil of Trace and Trail. 30 days from the time it left Dawson, the saltwater mail with Buck and his team at the front arrived at Skagway. They were in a sad state, worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had shrunk to 115. The rest of the dogs had lost even more, and although they were lighter than Buck to begin with, Pike, the dog, who often pretended to be injured, now had a genuine limp. Solix, too, was limping, and Dub was suffering from a pulled shoulder blade. They were terribly footsore. No spring and rebound was left in them. Their feet fell heavily on the trail, jolting their bodies and adding to the fatigue of the day's travel. There was nothing the matter with them except they were dead tired. It was not the tiredness that comes from brief and intense effort from which one recovers in a few hours. It was the dead tiredness that comes from the slow and lengthy drain of strength through months of heavy work. There was no power of recovery left, no reserve strength to call upon, and it had been all used, the least bit of it. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired, and there was a reason for it. In less than 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles, and during the last 18 of which they had only 5 days rest. Top of page 58. When they arrived at Skagway, they were on their last legs. They could barely keep the traces taut and were downgrades. They were managing to keep out of the way of the sled. "Mush on, poor sore feet," the driver encouraged them as they trotted unsteadily down the main streets of Skagway. "Dis is de last. Den one get one long rest, eh? For sure. One bully long rest." The driver confidently expected a long stopover. They themselves had covered 1,200 miles with 2 days' rest, and both fairness and common sense said they deserved to loaf for a while. But so many men had rushed through the Klondike, and so many sweethearts and wives and relatives had not rushed in, that mountains of mail were piling up. And in addition, there were official orders to be delivered. Fresh teams of Hudson Bay dogs were to take the place of those worthless for the trail. And the worthless were to be got rid of. And since dogs count for little against dollars, they were to be sold. 3 days passed, for which time Buck and the other dogs learned how really tired and weak they were. Then, one morning on the 4th day, 2 men from the States came along and bought them, harness and all, for a song. A song means cheap. The men called themselves Hal and Charles. Charles was a middle-aged pale man with weak and watery eyes. He had a mustache that twisted fiercely and vigorously up, hiding the limp and drooping lip beneath it. Hal was a youngster of 19 or 20 with a big Colt revolver and a hunting knife strapped about him on his belt that fairly bristled with cartridges. This belt was the most obvious thing about him. It advertised his lack of maturity, a lack that was complete and absolute. Top of page 59. Both men obviously were out of place, and why people like them should adventure to the north is one of those mysteries that cannot be understood. Buck heard the bargaining, saw the money pass between the men and the government agents, and knew that the Scot and the mail train drivers were passing out of his life, like Perrault and Francois, and the others had gone before. When he was driven with the other dogs to the new camp, Buck found a scruffy, untidy arrangement. The tent was half stretched, the dishes were unwashed, and everything was in disorder. Also, he saw a woman. The men called her Mercedes. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister. A nice family party. Buck watched them and worried as they proceeded to take down the tent and load the sled. There was such a great deal of effort in the way they did things, but no businesslike method. The tent was rolled into an awkward bundle 3 times larger than it should have been. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Ugh, that's gross. Mercedes continually got in the way of her men, and she kept up an unbroken stream of advice and criticism. When they put a clothes sack on the front of the sled, she suggested it should go on the back. And when they put it on the back and covered it with a couple of other bundles, she found an overlooked item that could go nowhere else but in the one sack they had unloaded again. She's a pain in the butt. 3 men from a neighboring tent came over and watched, grinning and winking at each other. "You got a right smart load as it is," said them, "and it's not me should tell you your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Undreamed of!" cried Mercedes, throwing her hands up in the air in a dainty dismay. "However in the world could I manage without a tent?" "It's springtime, and you won't get any more cold weather," the man replied. She shook her head decisively, and Charles and Hal put the last odds and ends on the mountainous load. "Think it'll ride?" one of the men asked. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded rather shortly. "Oh, that's all right, the man said meekly. "I was just a-wondering, that's all. It seems a mite top-heavy." Charles turned his back and drew the lashings down as well as he could, which was not well at all. "And of course the dogs can hike along all day with that contraption behind him," another man declared. "Certainly," said Hal with freezing politeness. He took hold of the gee pole with one hand and swung his whip with the other. "Mush!" he cried. "Mush on there!" The dog sprang against the breastband and strained hard for a few moments and then relaxed. They were unable to move the sled. "Ugh, the lazy brutes, I'll show them," he cried, getting ready to lash out again with his whip. But Mercedes interfered, crying out, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't." She caught hold of the whip and tore it from him. "The poor dears, now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step." "Precious lot you know about dogs," her brother sneered, "and I wish you would leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask anyone. Ask one of those men." Mercedes looked at them in despair. Horror on the sight of the pain was written on her pretty face. "They're weak as water, as you should know, my friend," came the reply from one of the men, plumb tuckered out. "That's what's the matter. They need a rest." "Rest be," said Hal, with his beardless lip. Mercedes said, "Oh," in pain and sorrow at the oath. But she was loyal to her family, and she rushed at once at the defense of her brother. "Never mind that man," she said sharply. "You drive our dogs, and you do what you think is best for them." Again, Hal whipped fell upon the dogs, and they threw themselves against the breastband, dug their feet into the snow, and put forth all their strength. The sled held as though it were an anchor. After 2 efforts, they stood still, panting. The whip was whistling savagely. When once more Mercedes stepped in, she dropped on her knees before Buck, with tears in her eyes, and put her arms around his neck. "Oh, you poor, poor dear," she said sympathetically. "Why don't you pull hard? Then you wouldn't be whipped." Buck did not like her, but he was feeling too miserable to resist. He took it as part of the day's miserable work. One of the onlookers, who had been clenching his teeth and holding back his anger, now spoke. "It is not that I care a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dog's sake, I just want to tell you, you can help them a mighty lot by breaking out the sled. The runners, the bottom of the sled, are frozen fast. Throw your weight against the gee pole left and right and break it out." Page 62. They tried the 3rd time, this time following the advice. Hal broke out the runners, which had indeed been frozen to the snow. The overloaded and awkward sled moved ahead. Buck and the other dogs struggled frantically under the reins of the blows. 100 yards ahead, the path turned and sloped steeply into the main street. It would have taken an experienced man to keep the top-heavy load right side up, and Hal was not such a man. And as they swung into the turn, the sled went over, spilling half of its load through the loose lashings, and the dogs never stopped. The lightened load sled bounced on its side behind him. They were angry because of the ill treatment that they had received, an unjust load. Buck was furious. He broke into a run, and the team followed his lead. Hal was crying, "Whoa, whoa," but they paid no attention. Hal tripped and was pulled off his feet. The overturned sled ground over him, and the dogs dashed ahead adding to the amusement of Skagway as they scattered the rest of the outfit along the main street. Thoughtful citizens caught the dog and gathered up the scattered belongings. As they gave advice, half the load and twice the dogs, if they expected ever to reach Dawson, they said. Hal and his sister and brother-in-law listened unwillingly. Then they pitched their tent and began the overhaul of their outfit. Men laughed that canned goods were turned out. For canned goods on a long trail are things to be dreamed about. Blankets for a hotel, said one man who laughed and helped. Half as many is still too much. Get rid of them. Throw away the tent and all those dishes. Who's going to wash them anyway? Good Lord. Do you think you are traveling on a Pullman or a train? And so it went, the unavoidable getting rid of what was not needed. Page 63. Mercedes cried when her clothes bags were dumped on the ground and article after article were thrown away. She cried in general and she cried in particular over each thing that was discarded. She clasped her hands around her knees, rocking back and forth as if her heart were broken. She said she was going not 1 inch, not for a dozen Charleses. She appealed to everybody and everything. Finally, she wiped her eyes and proceeded to throw away even those things that she could not do without. And in her enthusiasm, she attacked the belongings of her men after she had finished with her own and went through them like a tornado. They should leave her behind. When they were done, the outfit, although cut in half, was still an immense bulk. Charles and Hal went out in the evening and bought 6 outside dogs. These added to the 6 of the original team, and Teak and Kuna at the Huskies obtained at the Rink Rapids on the previous trip brought the team up to 14. But the outside dogs did not amount to much. 3 were short-haired pointers, 1 was a Newfoundland, and the other 2 were mongrels of an uncertain breed. They did not seem to know anything, these newcomers. Buck and his comrades looked at them with disgust. Although Buck quickly taught them their place and what not to do, he could not teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to the trace of the trail, except for the 2 mongrels. They were confused and spirit-broken by the savage, strange environment in which they found themselves, and by the bad treatment they had received. The 2 mongrels had no spirit at all, top of page 64. The only thing breakable about them were their bones. With the newcomers hopeless and miserable and the old team worn out by 2,500 miles of continuous trail, the outlook was anything but bright. The 2 men, however, were quickly cheerful. And they were proud, too. They were doing this thing in style with 14 dogs. They had seen other dogs depart from the pass over Dawson or come in from Dawson, but they had never seen a dog or sled dog with as many as 14 dogs. In the nature of the Arctic, there's a reason why 14 dogs should not be dragged in one sled. And that reason was simply that one sled could not carry enough food for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal didn't know this. They had worked the trip out with a pencil. So much to a dog, so many dogs, so many days. Mercedes looked over their shoulder and nodded. It was all so very simple. Late next morning, Buck led the long team up the streets, and they were nothing lively about them. No snap or go in them and his fellows. They were starting dead weary. 4 times he had covered this distance between Saltwater and Dawson, and the knowledge that he had facing the same trail once more made him bitter. His heart was not in the work, nor was the heart of any dog. The outside dogs were timid and frightened. The inside had no confidence in their new masters. Buck felt vaguely that one could not depend on these 2 men and women. They did not know how to do anything, and the days went by, and it became obvious that they could not learn. They were careless in all things, without order or discipline. It took them half the night to pitch a messy camp and half the morning to break the camp and get the sled loaded. They loaded it so carelessly that they spent much time of the day stopping and rearranging the load. Some days they did not make 10 miles. Remember, they used to make 30 to 40 in one day. On other days, they weren't able to start at all. And on no day did they make more than half the distance that was the basis of their dog food consumption. They could not avoid running short of food, but they hastened it by overfeeding and bringing closer the day when underfeeding would begin. The outside dogs, whose digestion had not been trained to make most of little, had huge appetites. And when in addition to this, the worn-out huskies pulled weakly, Hal decided that the usual ration was too small. He doubled it. And to cap it all off, when Mercedes, with tears in her pretty little eyes and a shake in her voice, could not coax him to give the dogs still more food, she stole from the fish sack and fed them on the sly. But it was not food that Buck and the huskies needed. They needed rest. And though they were making poor time, the heavy load that they drained their strength. Then came the underfeeding. Hal awoke one day to the fact that his dog food was half gone while they had covered only a quarter of the distance they had to go. He also realized for love or money, no additional dog food could be obtained. So he cut down to less than the usual ration. At the same time, he tried to increase the day's travel. His sister and brother-in-law backed him up, but they were held back by their heavy outfit and their own lack of skill. It was a simple matter to give the dogs less food, but it was impossible to make the dogs travel faster, and they were kept from traveling longer hours by their own inability to get underway earlier in the morning. Top of page 66. Not only did they not know how to work the dogs, but they did not know how to work themselves. The first to go was Dub. The poor blundering thief that he was, always getting caught and punished, he had nonetheless been a faithful worker. But without neither treatment or rest, his wrenched shoulder blade went from bad to worse, and finally Hal shot him with the big Colt revolver. It was easy to say of the country dogs, that the outside dogs starved to death on the rations of a husky. So on half a husky's ration, the 6 outside dogs could not do anything less than die. The Newfoundland went first, followed by the 3 short-haired pointers. The 2 mongrels hung on more stubbornly onto life, but they too went in the end. By this time, all the pleasant and gentle customs of the Southland had fallen away from the 3 people. With its glamour and romance gone, the Arctic travel became too harsh of a reality for them to deal with. Mercedes stopped weeping over the dogs, and she was too occupied weeping over herself and quarreling with her husband and brother. Quarreling or fighting was the one thing they were never too tired to do. Their bad tempers arose out of their misery. It increased as their misery increased and doubled and finally left it far behind. The wonderful patience of the trail comes to men who work hard and suffer much, and they remain sweet of speech and kindly, but that did not come to these 2 men and women. They had no notion of such patience. They were stiff and in pain. Their muscles ached, their bones ached, their very hearts ached. Because of this, they became sharp of speech, and hard words were said first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. Charles and Hal argued whenever Mercedes gave them a chance. Each of them believed that they did more than their share of work, and neither held back from speaking their belief at every opportunity. Sometimes Mercedes sided with her husband, sometimes with her brother. The result was a beautiful and unending family quarrel, starting from a dispute as to who could chop a few sticks of firewood, a dispute that only concerned Hal and Charles. The rest of the family soon would be dragged in, including fathers and mothers and uncles and cousins and people thousands of miles away, and some of them dead. It was hard to believe that Hal's view on art, or his sort of society play his uncle wrote, had something to do with the chopping of a few fire sticks. Nevertheless, the quarrel was as likely to be about that as Charles's political prejudices, and only Mercedes knew what Charles's sister's gossiping had to do with building of a Yukon fire. She supplied many opinions on the subject, and incidentally on a few other unpleasant traits to be found in her husband's family. Meanwhile, the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half-pitched, and the dogs unfed. Mercedes nursed a special complaint. She was pretty and soft, and she had been courteously treated her whole life. She's been spoiled. But the present treatment of her husband and brother was everything but courteous. She was used to being helpless, they complained. They had rejected that she was saw as her most basic right as a woman. So she made their lives unbearable. She no longer considered the dogs because she was sore and tired. She insisted on riding on the sled. She was pretty and soft, but she weighed 120 pounds, a last straw to the load dragged by the weak and starving animals. Top of page 68. She rode for days until the dogs fell in the traces and the sled stood still. Charles and Hal begged her to get off and walk, pleaded with her, begged her. Meanwhile, she wept and told heaven of the story of their brutality. On one occasion, they took her off the sled by force. They never did it again. She let her legs go limp like a spoiled child and sat down on the trail. They went on their way, but she did not move. After they traveled 3 miles, they unloaded the sled, came back for her, and put her on the sled again. Because of their own misery, they had no pity for the suffering of their animals. Hal's ideal, which he practiced on others, was that one must get hardened. He had started out preaching it to his sister and his brother-in-law, and after having no success with them, he hammered it into the dogs with a club. At the 5 Fingers the dog food gave out, a toothless old squaw, or Native American, offered to trade them a few pounds of frozen horsehide for the Colt revolver that kept the big hunting knife accompanied on Hal's hip. This hide was a poor substitute for food. It had been stripped from a starved horse of a cattleman 6 months earlier. In its frozen state, it was more like strips of iron than like food. When the dog wrestled it into its stomach, the hide thawed into thin, leathery strings and a mass of short hair. It irritated the dog's stomach and could not be digested and was completely lacking of nutrition. So it actually made the dog sicker. And through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the team as if he were in a nightmare. He pulled when he could, but when he could no longer pull, he fell down and stayed there until the blows from the whip or club drove him to his feet again. Page 69. All of the stiffness and gloss had gone out of his beautiful furry coat. His hair hung down limp and scruffy or matted with dried blood where Hale's club had bruised him. His muscles were wasted away to knotty strings and the flesh pads had disappeared. Each rib and every bone in his frame was clearly outlined through the loose and wrinkled skin. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that. As it was with Buck, it so was with the other dogs. They were walking skeletons. They were 7 altogether, including him. In their very great misery, they no longer felt the bite of the lash or the bruise of the club. The pain of the beating was so dull and distant, just as things their eyes saw and their ears heard seemed dull and distant. They were not half alive or even a quarter of alive. They were simply 7 bags of bones in which the spark of life fluttered faintly. All these dogs are so close to death because of the ill treatment. When a halt was made, they dropped in their traces like dead dogs. The spark dimmed and paled and seemed to go out. And when the club or the whip fell upon them, the spark fluttered up feebly, and they stumbled to their feet and staggered on. There came a day when Billy, the good-natured felon, could not rise. Hal had traded off his revolver, so he took the axe and knocked Billy on the head as he lay in the harness and traces. Then he cut the carcass out of the harness and dragged it to one side. Buck saw, and the other dogs saw, and they knew that this thing, death, was very close to them. On the next day, Kuna went. Now only 5 remain. Joe was too far gone to be harmful. Pike, crippled and limping, was only half conscious and not conscious enough to loaf. Page 71. Solix, the one-eyed, was still faithful to the work of the trace in the trail and sad because he had so little strength with which to pull. Teak, who had not traveled so far that winter, now was beaten more than the others because he was fresher. And Buck, still at the head of the team, no longer enforcing discipline, blind with weakness half the time. He kept the trail by the dim look of it and the dim feel of his feet. It was a beautiful spring weather, but neither dogs nor human were aware. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later. Dawn came at 3 in the morning and twilight lingered until 9 at night. The whole long day was a beautiful blaze of sunshine. The ghostly winter silence had given way to the great spring murmur of awakening life. This murmur arose from all the land, filled with the joy of living, and it came from the living and lived and moved again, things that had been as good as dead during the long winter months. The sap was rising in the pines, and the willows and the aspens were bursting out in young buds. Shrubs and vines were putting on fresh dresses of green. Crickets sang at night, and in the day all sorts of creepy crawly things rustled forth into the sun. Partridges and woodpeckers were booming and knocking in the forest. Squirrels were chattering, birds were singing, and overhead honked the wild geese flying up from the south in the wedge and that split the air. From every hill slope came the trickling of running water and the music of the unseen fountains. All things were thawing and bending and snapping, and the Yukon was straining to break loose from the ice that held it down. It ate the ice away from beneath, while the sun ate it from above. Page 72. Air holes formed and cracked and appeared and spread apart. Thin holes, sections of ice fell through into the rivers, and amid all this awakening, the 2 men and women and huskies staggered like travelers to death. With the dogs falling, Mercedes weeping and riding, and Hale swearing harmlessly, and Charles' eyes watering vaguely, they staggered into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of the White River. When they halted, the dogs dropped down as though they had been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down on a log, and he sat very slowly and carefully because of his great stiffness. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling the last touches on an axe handle he had made from a stick of birch. He whittled and listened and gave brief replies. When he was asked, he gave advice. He knew these kind of people, and when he gave them his advice, he was sure they would not be followed. They told us up above that the bottom was about to drop out of the trail, and the best thing for us to do was lay over, Hal said. This was his answer to Thornton's warning against taking any more chances on the rotten ice. They told us we couldn't make White River, and here we are. This last with a sneer of ringing of triumph. They told you true, John Thornton answered. The bottom is likely to drop out any moment. Only fools with the blind luck of fools could make it out there. I tell you straight, I would not risk my carcass or life on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. That's because you're not a fool, I suppose, said Hal. All the same, we'll get on to Dawson. He uncoiled his whip. Get up there, Buck. Hi, get up there, Buck. Mush on. Thornton went on whittling. He knew there was no point in trying to keep a fool from being foolish, and 2 or 3 fools, more or less, would not make much difference in the world. But the team did not get up on command. It had been a long time now since the only blows could get them on their feet. The whip flashed out. John Thornton compressed his lips. Solix was the first to crawl to his feet. Teak followed. Joe came next, yelping with pain. Pike made a painful effort. Twice he fell over from halfway. On the 3rd try, he managed to rise. But Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again, but he neither whined nor struggled. Several times Thornton started to speak, but he changed his mind. Tears came to his eyes, and the whippings continued. He arose and walked up and down, as if not sure what to do. This was the first time Buck had failed, and that alone was enough to drive Hal into a rage. He traded the whip for the usual club. Buck refused to move under the rains of the heavier blows that now fell upon him. Like the other dogs, he could barely get up. But unlike them, he had made up his mind that he would not give up. He had felt this feeling strongly when he pulled into this place, and it had not left him. With the thin ice and the rotten ice he could feel under his feet, he sensed disaster close at hand. It was out there ahead on the ice, where his master was trying to drive him. He refused to move. He had suffered so greatly and was so far gone, top of page 74, that the blows did not hurt much. And as the blows continued to fall on him, the spark of life within him flickered and went down. It was nearly out. He felt strangely numb, as though from a great distance he was aware that he was being beat. The last sensation of pain left him. He no longer felt anything, though very faintly he could hear the club hitting his body. But it was no longer his body. It seemed so far away. John Thornton stood over Buck, struggling to control his anger. He was shaking with rage that he could not speak. "If you strike that dog again, I will kill you," he managed at last to say in a choking voice. "It's my dog," Hal replied, wiping the blood from his mouth as he came back. "Get out of my way, or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson." Thornton stood between him and Buck. He showed no intentions of getting out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife. Mercedes screamed and cried and laughed uncontrollably. Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with the axe handle, knocking the knife to the ground. He rapped Hal's knuckles again, and as he tried to pick it up, then he stooped, picked it up himself, and with 2 strokes cut Buck's traces or harness. Hal had no fight left in him. Besides, his hands were full with his sister, or rather his arms were. Buck was now too near dead to be further use in hauling the sled. A few minutes later, they pulled out from the bank and down the river. Buck heard them go and raised his head. Pike was leading and Solix was in the front of the sled. Between were Joe and Teak. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding the loaded sled, and Hal guided at the gee pole and Charles stumbling along in the rear. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him with his rough and kindly hands searching for broken bones. His search found nothing more than many bruises in a state of terrible starvation. By this time, he had finished. The sled was a quarter of a mile away. Dog and man watched it crawl over the ice. Suddenly, they saw it. The back end dropped down, as if it had fallen into a rut. The gee pole, with Hal clinging to it, jerked into the air. They could hear Mercedes screaming. Charles turned and took 1 step to run back off the ice. Then the whole section of ice gave way, and dogs and humans disappeared. A yawning hole was all that was seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. John and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand.